much, and welcome everyone to this exciting panel on inclusive capitalism. And the starting point of the panel indeed is the Council for Inclusive Capitalism. And we will be going through what the Council is trying to achieve and what all of the participants of today's panel, who are also members of the founding members of the Council, including EY, are trying to achieve with trying to work towards inclusive capitalism. And I will very soon invite the panelists to give a short reflection on the Council, but especially their vision on inclusive capitalism, because they're all in it from their perspective. And I think they have quite a complementary picture to bring and to share some lead practices that they see out there working towards inclusive capitalism. Afterwards, we will have a question round, of course. We'll be speaking a little bit more about the challenges. We'll be all vulnerable and also saying what we haven't cracked yet, because we have a grand vision, but pretty sure we're not all sure yet how we're exactly going to get there. And obviously the floor is yours to ask any questions. And you may use the chat function to do so, as you know, and we will moderate the questions and pass them on to the panelists. So if you do ask a question, please state your name, because some of you are listed as anonymous. It does help to know your name so I can also refer to it and you know it's your question. And please do let me know who you would like to address the question to so I can direct them directly to the different panelists. So without much further ado, I did want to ask the panelists again to quickly reflect on how how we can really drive equality, more inclusive capitalism. I think since 2020, we really don't look at inclusive anymore just from a socioeconomic point of view or just from a gender perspective. We really look at inclusive from a much broader sense. And we really look at equity, equality, diversity, and inclusion. And that's really what the Council is also working towards. So I'd like to ask the panelists to share their vision on inclusive capitalism, on the Council, and how investors can drive systemic change needed to make capitalism more inclusive than it is today. So I'd like to ask the panelists one by one if they can share that. And I'll try to do it in reverse alphabetical order just to mix it up. So Sapna, would you like to share with our participants today what your view is and what practices are you see?
Yeah, absolutely. Good morning for me. Good afternoon. I'm Sapna with the Global Impact Investing Network, and thanks so much for having me on this discussion. I think just starting out, one thing that's important to reflect on is that inclusive capitalism is not in and of itself a goal. It's a pathway to a future where there is a financial system and an economic system that benefits more people and invests in the well-being of the planet. Where I sit at the Global Impact Investing Network, we work primarily with impact. So that's just one aspect of a much bigger ecosystem involved and necessary to create a change towards an inclusive capitalism system. But I think one thing with that is that, what we're starting to see really is whereas impact investing was part and focus of a carve-out, a focused and dedicated push towards impact, really what we're driving towards is a impact as a lens across all investment. And I think investors have quite a bit of experience being very diligent in assessing impact, especially the impact investing community has piloted lots of ways to measure impact, to figure out what sorts of objectives are realistic for investors and what kinds of pathways exist, what kinds of investee options, and really trying to integrate impact across the portfolio. So I think impact investing is one significant driver towards an inclusive system, certainly working in concert with a lot of others, but just keeping in mind that neither of those in and of themselves, it's really about a sustainable planet and people who are taking care of.
Thank you very much, Sapna. That's a great intro. Margot, would you like to share your view, your vision and lead practices from your perspective?
Sure. Thank you, Eric, and thank you for having me. I want to apologize. I already did so to my fellow co-panelists. It's spring break where I live, and so I'm hiding outside a house so that my children don't Zoom bomb me. But in exchange, I have birds chirping. So I'm hoping that everyone will forgive me for that. But so I sit at the Ford Foundation, which is the second largest foundation in the United States. Our mission is to address inequality in all its forms. Our headquarters is in New York, which is actually proudly serving as a vaccination site as we speak, and we have 10 offices around the world. And I sit in our mission investments team, which is unique for most philanthropies in that it combines an allocation of $1 billion from our endowment for what we call mission-related investments, which is a type of impact investing. We have a program-related investment or catalytic investment portfolio, and we have a grant portfolio. And our MRIs and our PRIs are impact investments, which is where my background is. And those are, investments made with intent to generate positive environmental or social impact in addition to financial return. And with our grant budget and our memberships and elsewhere, we seek to grow the impact investing field with integrity. And, we've been so pleased to see it grow. I think SEPNA was, $715 billion in assets under management last year. We're very proud to support the GIN and other industry groups. But even at $715 billion, impact investing is still, a tiny fraction of the global capital markets. And we recognize that it is those global capital markets that are either a headwind or a tailwind for all the other issues that Ford works on. And so we do have a focus on making those broader capital markets more inclusive, less extractive, and in service of the foundation's overall mission to address inequality. So we are a proud supporter of the Council for Inclusive Capitalism. My boss, Darren Walker, is a guardian. And I think, there's a number of names for this. There's inclusive capitalism, stakeholder capitalism. Some people like the word regenerative capitalism. The names do and don't matter, and maybe we can get to that. But I think they all share a few important attributes. The idea that capitalism needs to produce an equitable distribution of benefits or a shared prosperity for all people, and that our practices need to operate within planetary boundaries. And you see different motivations. Frankly, some are pure business motivations. Some are ethical motivations. I think the number of members of the council have spiritual motivations for this work. And I think there's room for all of that, right? Those are complementary. They're not mutually exclusive. And, something else maybe we'll get to is that I think the lines between impact and inclusive capitalism can become blurred. I think the Impact Management Project has a useful framework, right? An ABC framework where A, I think, is act to do no harm, B is benefit stakeholders, and C is contribute to solutions. So I think we're more or less in the B category when we talk about, inclusive capitalism. But I think, an important concept that differentiates it from, traditional, what might be called corporate social responsibility is that we're really talking about the entire business model and not just a small, de minimis part of a company or an investment fund. And it's really about reforming these overall business practices to be in service of that greater goal of inclusivity. Ford, with our own capital, has a focus on 4 sectors that I'm happy to talk about. But I think, equally important, we look for things like representation, Eric, which you mentioned. We feel strongly that management teams, investment committees, really all the human capital chain needs to be diverse. We want to see stakeholder voice, governance. I think whether it's, corporate boards overseeing ESG performance or, actual stakeholder governance, like a benefit corporation. And we think whether, we're talking about impact investing or this broader field of inclusive capitalism, that metrics matter because, you can't manage what you don't measure. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I always give you 5 seconds. You never know with connections. It's a little awkward.
I can keep going. I'm
keep going. I know, and I would have probably stopped you in 30 seconds anyways. But thank you so much, Margot. This is really, really, really useful. There's a couple of points there in terms of your vision on inclusive capitalism and measurement that I'll definitely get back to. The importance of measurement, because that's originally where the council also originated from. So before I go to Anna, actually, to give a little bit more background, because I realized that not everyone may know the Council for Inclusive Capitalism. Indeed, it's this broad group of initially 20 global leaders from businesses, but also from foundations and from non-governmental organizations, as you see represented in its diversity today on this panel, to really work towards inclusive capitalism. And in a way, it originated from the Embankment Project for Inclusive Capitalism, which was really a initiative led by 30 businesses and academics to think through how do you measure long-term value creation and that's long-term value creation is, again, a name, if names don't matter, speaking your words, Margot, it's just a way of measuring impact and being able to steer on impact and report on impact in a comparable and consistent way. And the council really emerged to implement that thinking further and to make sure that more businesses and non-governmental organizations and government organizations, et cetera, would implement that thinking as well. And inclusiveness in the broadest sense of the word, indeed, has already come to light. So, Anna, may I pass it on to you to share your views?
Yeah, sure. So just for a bit of context, so I work in the Chief Investment Office and I run investment selection for the Wealth Management Division of Bank of America. But I've also been, for the last 8 years, co-leading the strategy on how to integrate sustainability and impact into the investments that our clients make. And then I also, in that role, sit on the Sustainable Finance Council, which is the overarching body that is going to implement sustainability and impact investing across all the lines of business of Bank of America. And so in that work, we have really sort of two pillars. One is environmental transition and financing and investing in that space. And then, of course, a Venn diagram gets formed with our other pillar, which is inclusive capitalism, right? And when and things in the middle of that include just transition and all of the other things that cross between, obviously, the environment and inequality, a society that's equal and economies that are equal for all to participate in. So, those are the two main sort of tenets and sort of ways that we're thinking about our strategy. And I think that encompasses lots of different, first of all, it goes across asset classes. And I really agree with Sapna and Margot on, impact investing and what sort of traditionally you think of as pure impact investing. Really sort of in the private markets is where a lot of people still think of that, but your ability to bring that into public markets and the mainstream markets, because obviously that's where a lot of assets sit and where a lot of capital flows are as well as the private markets, is really important. And I think that, again, Margot, totally agree that the ability to create investment opportunities for people to invest in that are, if we're going back to the impact management project, which we use to classify investments ourselves internally, and where you're shifting not only from avoid to benefit, but from benefit to actually contribute, which is sort of the C of the ABCs. Where I still think, and I'm happy to talk about this in a little bit, but where the solutions, a lot more focus and a lot more development we think needs to happen around solutions for actually contributing, right? Because you can't change things if you do not have products. I think we can have this debate, but I think just stopping at corporations that are being good to their stakeholders is phenomenal, but we do have to go that one step further and really sort of press on solutions and products that do change the way that economies are structured, right? And which is this concept of inclusive capitalism, right? And so I think that that's a big sort of focus of ours, financing and product development and investment. But also, certainly, and I think people saw announcements coming from the new administration, policy making blend, it will provide a really important tailwind here. Blended capital, which has been, blended capital structures are extremely necessary to make all of that happen. And our foundation and some of the announcements that we've made around an inclusive economy in the US, obviously in reaction strongly to the events of 2020 and continuing to 2021, and what this crisis is going to pose in terms of additional issues for society, really needs to happen in sort of, not just the capital markets, but in policy making and in sort of all pools of capital, we believe. But I do, to go back, Margot, to this reporting, impact, and as I say, can't only be in, the private markets, right? It has to it has to exist somehow in the public debt and equity markets. And, I think a lot of the work, Eric, that E&Y did, among other of the big four, around the International Business Council of the World Economic Forum, that our CEO was spearheading at the time, and that work around metrics that are not the be all and end all maybe of only the metrics that corporate should report, but they do have really important links to the SDGs, and there's an entire pillar there around prosperity, right? Which is and capital. How do corporates report on their activities around how their communities and how the system, right, is affected, if you will, by the financing and the investing that and other activities, obviously products and services and manufacturing that companies are doing. So I think, convergence around metrics that corporates have to report, whatever they are, that also, not only identify the risks and sort of the best practices and sort of the A and B column, but really sort of where they're contributing and how they're geared towards creating an inclusive economy are really important to us.
Awesome. Thank you, Anna. And indeed, and it's good that you mentioned the IBC, the International Business Council initiative, because that's also a spin-off of the Council for Inclusive Capitalism, at least the Embankment Project for Inclusive Capitalism. So you see that project was very busy. I was one of the facilitators of that, but a couple of initiatives that were quite a bit more tangible came out of that, and indeed is also continuing in that way. And hopefully the Council is strengthening the metrics piece, because I think we do need both. I agree. And Anastasia, could I please ask your reflections as our fourth panelist?
Yes, of course. Thanks, Eric, and good morning, afternoon, everyone. I'm going to agree with all of my fellow panelists in some part. With Sapna, that this is a lens, that with Margot, that this is about how do you actually look at benefit and contribution and move everyone along. And PRI has 100 trillion plus assets under management signed up to it, which essentially means the vast majority of the market globally is signed up to the principles. So our take on this has to be, how do we move all of that capital, as the panelists have been talking about, toward sustainable outcomes, towards sustainability performance. And a couple of years ago, we stood back and we said, now, how do we do this? We also are, let's be honest, it's not the 100 trillion, that many of them would balk at the idea that they're impact investors. So we have to get them along with every sort of means we have at our disposal. And what we decided to do was set out a framing for them. And eventually this framing will become more and more embedded. It already has become embedded in our annual reporting that they have to do to us, but will become more embedded in some of our requirements, shall we say, of signatories. We said all investors and all investments have outcomes. They have positive outcomes and negative outcomes. And what we have to start to do is enhance our positive outcomes and reduce our negative outcomes. We're constantly being told by the UNCTAD and other bodies that we've got 5 to 7 trillion that we need to produce every year from the private markets to be able to, from private capital essentially, to be able to finance this. And the Secretary General recently said that this is not coming. The scale is just nowhere near what it needs to be, which means it's not just additional capital, but existing capital that needs to pivot into these things. And so how do you make that happen? And so what PRI did was we said that financial materiality of ESG issues, which is essentially the bread and butter of mainstream ESG thought process. So in effect, what impact is the portfolio having on the world? We need to include a parallel analysis of the most important outcomes to society and the environment at a systemic level. And these material issues and the real world outcomes we're looking for will overlap, but they don't fully overlap. And that's the gap that we need to plug to meet the SDGs. And to do that, we said, look, all investors to the principles of responsible investment need to eventually, and we've given them a time frame, have a 5-part framework. First, they have to identify and understand the unintended outcomes of their current investments and operations. And this will be both, as I said before, positive and negative. And this actually aligns with the direction of travel that's coming out of the EU, where they say all, funds that look at ESG will have to talk about do no significant harm principles. What are the negative outcomes of what you're investing in? The second thing they'll have to do is they need to set policies and targets to move away from unintended outcomes towards more intentional steps to enhance positive and reduce negative outcomes. And then the third thing that investors do by themselves is to seek to shape those outcomes through the tools they have at their disposal that we talk about all the time in the mainstream risk return ESG world, which is investment decisions, stewardship, and as Margot and Sapna and Anna have been talking about, which is engagement with policymakers and with stakeholders. And then the last two bits of it, of the 5-part framework, is the financial system then needs to start collating these individual cases to shape collective outcomes, because this is, as we know, a failure of collective action. This is why we struggle with all of these problems. And then we need global stakeholders to collaborate to achieve the outcomes, all in line with the SDGs. Our CEO, Fiona, likes to call the SDGs the world's business plan. And that's what we have to work towards. I'll stop there for now.
Thank you very much, Anastasia. And again, a good couple of points, and maybe just for reference of everyone, because maybe everyone knows, but for example, the EU's definition of do no significant harm and stuff, that's been consolidating in EU law, for example, in the EU taxonomy. That is, we already saw a leaked draft of the delegated act that's going to solidify that. And that's really going to help at a definition level, consolidated language on what is sustainable, what can be classified as a sustainable economic activity and not. And sustainable, again, is a similar word as we would talk about inclusive capitalism now. That's going to be very interesting because that's going to impact any company working or dealing with the European market, which is basically the entire world. So that's going to hopefully help to work towards a common language. And that common language, and I think measurement was mentioned a lot of times. I did want to quickly go by the panel and get your view on measurement. You've already said quite a few things on that, but the power of measurement. But there's also some areas that we haven't quite cracked it yet, right? I think in the environmental space, if we look at ESG, we have quite a good set of metrics. There's really no excuse anymore to integrate that in decision making. But on some of the other areas, and S&G maybe a little bit less. Do you have some examples of best practices, or actually maybe challenges where you say, like, honestly, we haven't cracked that yet? We would welcome any views on where we should look to really quantify impact, inclusivity on an S&G perspective more.
So I'm happy to comment on this. I wasn't sure if you had a specific person in mind. At the Global Impact Investing Network, we feel pretty fundamentally, and have since our inception about a decade ago, that measurement is pretty fundamental to impact investing and also to driving towards overall a more inclusive system. I think it's remarkable that many of the things that have already come up on this panel, so what Anna was talking about needing to know what products there are, what are the actual solutions that work. Some of the discussion that's come up around helping the industry together coordinate towards driving towards a financial system. None of those things are actually possible without data, first of all. And so, that's just a first and foremost sort of plug for measurement if you weren't sold already. For for the GIN, we have a system that we work with for investors called Iris Plus. And what we've done is taken metrics that are evidence-backed that show what kinds of things you might need to measure in order to know that you are driving towards certain longer-term outcomes. And so while it may not be possible always to measure those longer-term outcomes right away, you can measure certain outputs that are indicative that you're driving towards certain outcomes. And so that's one step, is to really identify metric sets that are core and fundamental to certain objectives, but that alone is not enough. One of the next steps, I think, in really sort of understanding impact performance, both at an individual investor level and as an industry, is then what are actually the calculation pathways that you need to get to understand how you combine those data points into something that makes meaningful sense. And here the GIN is piloting impact performance assessments in a couple of different sectors. We've done financial inclusion, agriculture, clean energy, a couple of others under works. And what we're trying to drive towards really fundamentally is being able to allow investors simple analytical tools and frameworks to compare their investments either to their own objectives or to a previous point in time or to others in a peer set. That's really fundamentally what I think is going to move the needle. There are a lot of challenges with that, to your point. But I think, if you take a step back from impact investing and measurement alone towards looking at inclusive capitalism, I think what's hard is that there are so many things necessary to push us in that direction. It's measurement. There's also mindset shifts just from the general public. I mean, it's really literally all of us expecting something completely different from our economy. And I mean, how do you do that at a personal level and at an industry level? One of the other sort of pieces of work that GIN is undertaking, and thanks to partners, including Margot from on this call, but we've done a bit of a sense making of different organizations that are interested in driving towards a more sustainable capitalism system. And one of the findings is it's sort of hard to agree what the actual problem is and what the drivers of change are. And there's a lot of different versions of what that could look like. And probably all of them very, very fundamentally important, whether where the change is going to come from policy or from investor behavior or from public demand. The truth is probably all of it. But how do you work on all of that at the same time, I think is one big challenge.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy. Yeah, I'm happy to follow on just quickly on that. I mean, I remember having, this was a few years ago, having a conversation with one of the major data providers in ESG. And I said to the head of research, I said, come on, there's got to be data that exists around, racial and gender diversity that you have that is just maybe not statistically there's got, and she said, no, there's actually that the lack of data, right, in those areas, right, is just a huge issue. And, there are a lot of interesting data providers now working on, how you sort of, use AI and big data and scrape the internet to recreate those data sets almost, to try to get, and a lot of this data exists and is maybe sitting in different organizations' databases, and as they do fundamental research either in the public and private markets. But there's not, but this sort of set of standardized or even not standardized, but just sort of data that you can use to create products, right? That actually. When I say products, it's it's a very wide range of things that I'm talking about, but to even create opportunities for investors to invest in things that look and feel inclusive, but actually then at the end of the day say, yes, that I can prove that that's what my capital was doing, right? That's how the capital markets work, right? People want to have metrics and hurdles and things that they can meet, and you can't do that without data. So I think I always say that there's we have huge demand from our client base, and we have millions of clients across all different parts of the wealth spectrum, mostly in the U.S. to be fair, but we have huge demand for investing in an equal, inclusive economy. And the frustration, is that, you basically either have, and by the way, these are great products and there's a lot of work to do in both of these areas, to be fair, but, it seems strange that you basically have, women on board index or emerging market microfinance, right? Sort of your set of, existing products in this space. There's got to be, a better range, right? And I know people are working on this, but there's a long way to go. I think that's a big hurdle towards getting capital moving towards the goals that Anastasia was talking about before.
Eric, I'll just jump in. I just want to really echo that in our experience, the S and the G are underrepresented. And so, for example, we've been a supporter of SASB, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, from the beginning. And currently, I think if you look at the SASB metric universe, 90% are in the E category. And they're working on that. There's a human capital management project that they're doing. And so I expect that to change. But 90% is quite dramatic. And for, an investor, for an entity like Ford that's really focused on the S and the G, that's not enough. And so I think, a couple of things. One, if we can, for those of us who expand the aperture beyond a fairly narrow definition of financial materiality at the enterprise level, right, we can get at issues of stakeholder value because they show up as systemic risk factors. And so it is shocking to me, but we may not yet have the data to support that pay gap, pay inequity by race or gender is financially material at the company level. But, Citibank produces a report estimating that racism cost the U.S. economy $16 trillion. And you can certainly look at aggregate studies that I think document why and how this is a systemic risk. And so, I'm not naive about the constraints that investors operate under, but I think taking a more expansive view of risk, if not sort of stakeholder benefit, is helpful and actually quite critical. I think the other part of that is there's, let me, I will leave it at that. I just want to appreciate something in addition to this under attention to the S and the G. I think the fragmentation that we see across metrics has contributed to the challenge in some ways. Ford did a study maybe a year and a half ago, actually. It was pre-COVID, so there's a lost year in my brain. And we documented literally hundreds of approaches to measuring and managing non-financial performance. And so one of the things that I really appreciated, we talked about the WEF IBC metric set, is that they didn't create any new metrics, right? Those, I think 20 metrics were built on existing metrics. And then because this is such a dynamic space, I saw only, I think, a few days ago that the WEF IBC sort of threw its support behind what the IFRS is launching in terms of its own sustainability standards board. So I think that spirit of coordination, of capturing sort of systemic or global problems, and of hopefully convergence is the direction. I'm cautiously optimistic, just given how challenging it's been. And the last thing I'll say is, Anna, to your point, I think investor interest is critical in driving this. And in part, I think that helps get us off the binary of whether something is financially material or impactful or stakeholder material, right? If investors are demanding something, then by definition, that is financially material, right? Because it's going to influence the allocation of capital. And so, there's long-term research that's needed, but I do think this investor interest is going to be one of the things that helps us leapfrog and get to where we need to be, in a shorter time frame.
Anastasia.
I so echo what Margot is saying. So what we have done is, for the first time, put about 32 indicators in our reporting framework. And let's face it, 3,000 global investors report to the PRI on these issues through the reporting framework. It's the largest reporting on the total universe of ESG issues in the world. And the first time we've put 32 indicators on sustainability outcomes. And they're all sort of fairly challenging, and they're voluntary because we've had to keep it voluntary. What's interesting is that we have found exactly the same things. The S has been very, very different. There's been interest, but what does that mean? There's been pockets of activity, but what does that mean? There have been people wanting to go on the index that looks at women in boards, but so what? And so the question is, how do we elevate? And so true about SASB, and 90% of all materiality is based on E, and PRI sees there's all the sustainability outcomes that people have reported before our new framework came into being, was all on net zero and E issues. And even there's no consensus. I mean, yes, it's further ahead, but whether it should be carbon intensity, whether it should have scope 3, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a problem everywhere. That there it seems a little bit more advanced. But what the PRI has done is, again, we're looking at systemic change. And what worked with E was putting the policies in place. And putting the policies in place led to actions and activities, which then the so what question, what were the outcomes? What we need to do is accelerate what we're doing on social very, very quickly. And so what we've done, and it's now mandatory for PRI signatories to report on this, and I shall leave it at that. It's going to become a little stricter as we go along, is we're using the human rights lens. So again, using the UN, which is of course where we come from, we're saying the UN GPs have to be the basis of a due diligence across your entire firm on human rights. Are you doing it? Are you not doing it? What are your policies on it? What have you found from doing it? And this is a really big education. I don't come from this background, and for me, it's been a big education of changing the investor conversation from materiality to salience, which is what the UNGPs force you to do. And that is, doing that to 100 trillion over. Our commitment is over 3 years, because once we start making human rights, we want to elevate human rights to the same level as climate, and within it sits DEI, within it sits inequality, gender, what we're calling decent work, privacy, a lot of the old G issues, tax fairness, which actually investors really care about. All of this sits within that lens, and we really hope that this is our contribution to try and get these big pools of capital to start thinking about this.
Thank you all. This has been this is hugely helpful to share your perspectives and building on it on each other. We do have some questions from the audience coming in, and I did want to also just tell the audience again, like, you can ask questions. We will be addressing the questions coming in from you very soon. I just had one more question in the meantime. And also to echo what Margot is saying, and all of you are really saying, is that, for example, the IBC metrics, some people criticize them for being too simple and just taking existing metrics, but you need to consolidate and become consistent and form a base and get as many companies, many firms as possible, and non-governmental actors again on board to get a definition and then build from there. Because there is a bit of analysis paralysis, especially in the e-space, that we also don't know anymore where to steer towards. So that's why it's always about measurement. Can you steer on the information? Because if you have hundreds of conflicting measures, you can't steer on the information. And then how do you disclose that information? How do you disclose that to your investors? How do you disclose that to your investees? What do you ask from your investees? Those questions. But it is important to kind of set the base and get there. And I want to, at the end, I will get back to you with your key takeaways, and I will definitely ask you what the key challenge is and what your key recommendation is to start doing today or tomorrow. But for now, in terms of the mindset shifts, some of you have mentioned that already, in terms of the systemic change, who can possibly take the initiative? Because the council, for example, tries to bring parties together, but who could possibly take the initiative for that systemic change apart from all of us together, of course? Would like to share something on the more systemic issues. It could be short-termism around the ways that we work now and the ways that we also have quarterly reporting, etc. Anna, I see you.
Well, I'll take a stab here. I don't know if it's a who. But that's maybe what's tripping me up anyway. But because you go through the list of like, well, should it be policymakers or should it be the private sector? And I don't know if we would ever get consensus around that if you. If you hear anecdotal stories, for instance, around how the SDGs came around, you would find that there's probably not a exact owner. But I do think that, to pick up on something that Margot was saying, a stat that she quoted right from Citibank, right? There is still a gap between demand and wanting to invest, and as Anastasia was saying as well, right? And a very clear economic case for investing in inclusive economies. So I remember, actually, I think it was at the PRI conference many years ago. There was a speaker who said that you have to, in the US anyway, the way that markets work is that they get convinced of a case for something, the business or the investment or the economic case for something. And that he was talking about environmental investing. It was David Blood, by the way, to give him credit. And he was saying that you have to continually make this case for environmental investing. Right. And that's, so you seize every opportunity to do that. And I think the case has been made, obviously, globally, right, with some stops and starts in the U.S. Certainly for environmentally focused investing, and that is 100% required. But I don't think the case, at least from a U.S. investor standpoint, is as strong, right, from a purely economic, rather than just sort of wanting to do the right thing, right? And there are certainly a set of clients that want to do, quote unquote, the right thing, right? And that's their motivation. But the majority of people who are investing for, to meet their financial goals, to live their lives, right? And so, I think there's still a gap. So I don't know who's responsible for educating the entire investor base of the world around that, but I do think that, whenever, it's a really important to continue to make that investment or economic case for this type of investment, if that helps.
Absolutely, thank you. And really short, I am, as maybe the people who asked the questions have noticed, I'm consolidating questions because we got so many questions in. So the question I just posed is a combination of 2 or 3 questions that were posed. One other really clear question that came up is what your organization specifically are doing on the mindset shift that we spoke about. And the second one that came in that's very specific is if someone knows whether human right, I'm sorry, I'm looking at the right because that's where I have the questions coming in. It's not, whether human rights lens correlates positively with financial performance, or whether there's not enough data yet to prove this, coming from our S&G data discussion. So I don't know who would like to take either of these 2 questions. Margot, yeah.
I'll offer some thoughts. These are like big, heavy topics. When we get to the sort of narrative shift, Ford has supported what is still a pretty nascent coalition called Imperative 21, which includes the Council for Inclusive Capitalism, as well as a number of our other grantees and partners in this space. And they're really coming together, despite using different language, inclusive capitalism, stakeholder capitalism, there's others, to try and come together for the benefit of narrative change. And so, for example, on the 50th anniversary of Milton Friedman's New York Times essay about the statement of the purpose of a corporation, they released a lot of iconography, a lot of quite powerful imagery. For example, replacing a NASDAQ ticker line with living wage and GHG emissions and the type of metrics that that they would hope we will be anchored around, in addition to earnings per share and the metrics that currently drive so much capital. And they broadcast these icons, on the NASDAQ tower in Times Square and in Sao Paulo. And they're working with participant media, which has brought so many films and really trying to, I think, expand the aperture in terms of the tools in the toolkit and get at this, broad challenge of narrative change, because I think, investor actions, even government policy, often follows from this much less tangible, frankly, much harder to impact narrative and normative change. And so this group of organizations is doing that. It's really hard. So I think we'll all see, whether and how they're able to be successful. And, I do think, though, this conversation needs to be broadened, right? If we look at where capital is invested, the underlying beneficiaries of that capital, be they working people whose pensions are being invested, taxpayers, where sovereign wealth funds are deploying capital, the long-term interests of those beneficiaries is often not maximized by a singular focus on short-term profitability, right? Workers have children and grandchildren and breathe air and, need an economy that's going to provide broadly. And so if we can get those underlying beneficiaries to engage in the conversation and to demand the types of outcomes that maximize their well-being, and I recognize this is sort of abstract and pie in the sky, but truly, I think even if a fraction of that conversation happens, that we will start to see different outcomes and we will start to see more convergence between, Anna, as you were saying, this sort of economic case, particularly at the company level, and the moral case for really thinking quite dramatically differently about capital.
Anastasia.
Yeah, Eric, if I could come in on that. Yeah, I agree with all of that. I think what we're finding is that on everything, not just on the social and governance issues, but on everything, the incentives within the structure are, we clearly don't work. And part of that is to do with the way finances operate in the last 20 years. Part of that has to do with regulation or deregulation. But we believe that everyone's going to have a role to play, from civil society to investors, fundamental bottom-up, top-down, all types of strategies and shops, listed, non-listed. The issue is, are the feedback loops quick enough? Because we can't wait for how long it took the green movement to get to where it's got to. And we don't have, the SDGs are too dispersed to come up with a net zero commitment by 2050, 50% reduction by 2030. That is the goal on climate. And, we're nowhere near even knowing how to do that. But at least that's what we know here, because the metrics are so dispersed. One of the things that Anna was saying that really hit home, and something that we're going to have to do eventually, and I think one of the things that we're going to do in this year of collecting this data, is to try and see on the social governance factors, what are the actions that seem to have the biggest material impact, both from a fundamental perspective as well as a top-down sectoral perspective. Because until we can at least drill down on that, and it won't cover everyone, it won't cover everything, but we know there are some proxies that we could use to be able to do something about it now. And PRI will definitely do that, but I think other actors in the market will do that, and we'll start to see convergence. We just need it to happen much faster.
Thank you. And anyone to comment further on human rights and correlating with financial performance? It was quite a...
There's a lot of academic data, and if you go onto the PRI website, you can see it, but it's not conclusive. It's not conclusive. If it was, we wouldn't be having this conversation. Everyone would be doing this. So you're going to have to make, and because it's so dispersed, every investor has to make assumptions on their own materiality. But can I just make this last point, because this is again something that I've learned, and it was a light bulb moment for me on human rights. I'm not an expert there, where it's now about what impact is the portfolio having on the world, salience. So in your supply chains, in your operations, and in your products and your services, what within the UNGPs, the UN guiding principles on human rights, what are the areas that are most impacted by your particular firm's actions? And what are you doing to mitigate that? And it suddenly makes it a lot, it's based on materiality by its nature, because it's not saying look at absolutely everything. It's look at the things that are most material to your operations. So it's built for businesses. And I think that it's just not widely understood. So it's our job to make sure that happens over the next year or two.
Absolutely, and I think it's also about really thinking through, right? Some companies, I have a lot of clients who say like human rights is not an issue to us, and I'm like, well, living wage is, right, and like something around inclusivity. You really try to peel it. You try to really kind of peel it down, and you try to have the conversation about what may matter, and like who is going to, when we talk about equity, who is going to pay the cost associated to climate adaptation. If you start those questions. But again, living wage is also on the socioeconomic front a very clear topic where you have socioeconomic human rights that can be really easily measured. A lot of companies say that they can't, but it's super simple, and there's databases that exist for it, and that really gives you a good view on that. But I did want to mention that. Please, Sapna, feel free to. You wanted to share something as well.
Oh, sure. Yeah. No, I mean, I think that the question you raise around the who's driving the mindset shift really is it's the hard question. I think that's probably why you got a bit of a pause from all of us, because as I was saying earlier, I do think it's going to come from everywhere. And I think to Anastasia's point, it's really it's not who's driving the change, because I think that change is coming from a number of different directions, but then whose job is it to sort of make sense of it all and weave it together, and who can do that fast enough for it to start to make sense to everyone. I think that's really the crux of the matter, is that it is to Margot's point about shifting the dialogue, and the GIN now sits also and partners within I-21 as well, and is engaged in pushing this narrative shift about what capitalism is and what money is supposed to do. And I think what's interesting is that dialogue sits up here, and it's so important and so intangible, and it's really the precursor to any kind of tangible changes, as Margot was saying. But the nature of those tangible changes starts to look so different depending on where you are. And so, at the GIN, we work with investors all around the world. The dialogue around racial equity that is very relevant with investors we work with that are focused in the US doesn't translate in exactly the same way everywhere, and neither does the dialogue around living wage, for example. The communities that are included and in power and excluded and not in power are really different, and so are the policies. And so how do you bridge that gap between the narrative shift to the tangible change? I think that's really fundamental. And I realize, the mindset shift needs to happen even for those of us that are working in this. I've reflected quite a bit on some of the language that even I've used in the past of needing to engage beneficiary populations in dialogue, or needing to reach out to these communities. And that's still sort of like a top down. It's not really about engagement. It's about how do you get all of us as people to own this conversation and expect more. And that's really the shift. And we're not quite there yet, but I think we will be. We keep going.
Thank you for sharing. So in 2 or 3 minutes, the moderator of the event will be stepping in. So the super moderator, way more influential than me, who will tell us to give our key takeaways. So I did want to go by the whole panel and ask you for your, to kind of close this, this session, to close with what your key takeaways, recommendations are, and try to structure them around what you think is lead practice, and again, what challenge you haven't seen being cracked. And there could also be a cry for help. I mean, cry for help sounds dramatic, but you know what I mean? It could be like, hey, we're really trying to solve this. If anyone has a great idea, just, drop it in the chat or whatever. There's a couple more questions that came into the chat about like partnering, that investors should be much more collaborative, especially reducing reporting boundaries and increasing data proliferation, and secondly, finding data on gender and race. Who could potentially collect that kind of data, and how can we use it? Those are some of the questions that also came up. So if you do want to address them in your closing remarks, please feel free to. But try to keep it short. I recognize I've spoken for a long time, but please try to keep it short now in your key takeaways. And I'll go reverse, and I'll start with Anastasia this time.
A lot to do, starting with education. As I said, we're going to use the human rights lens to educate the market and try to get everything underneath that sort of big umbrella up to the level of climate in 3 years. Hopefully that will help solve some of the problems of the others.
Yep. Anna.
Yeah, I would say that, I know a lot of people are gearing towards COP26, you can't drag along an economy to change around energy and the environment and leave this behind. They have to be as important as one another because they're so interconnected.
Awesome. Margot.
And I just want to add, I think we have to meet everyone, be they pools of capital or individual people, where they are and move them up a curve. And so, for example, if investors are coming with a strong climate lens, then maybe a just transition, or that intersection of the Venn diagram between people and planet, not to invoke a cliche, is the right place to meet folks and move them up the curve. But I think the urgency is there. I think, frankly, we're all going to be eventually held accountable by our stakeholders, whether they're voters, taxpayers, clients, workers. But it takes courage. And I think, as we talked about, each of us needs to find our own ways to lead, but also to follow and to collaborate.
Thank you. Sapna.
Sure. I think we need to do, by we as an industry, quite a bit more to help make sense of the different sort of thought bubbles that are out there: ESG, impact, sustainability, responsibility. And I don't mean at a conceptual level, but I mean at a very tangible, practical level in terms of the way that investment screening is done, portfolios are constructed, measurement is done, and literally also the staff who's literally working on those different topics within an organization. It's quite chunky right now, and I think if we can kind of make that a bit more seamless, it'll go a long way towards our goals.
Great, thank you so much. So we have 2 minutes left. I was promised that we would be joined by the MC, so I guess we beat the MC.
Mark.
Oh, okay, there we are. Apologies.
Here we are. No, Eric, Big Brother's watching all the time, and I like
good.
that.
Thank you for letting us wrap up.
I like that super moderator thing of yours. But, let me be frank, you've done the tougher job here, because after all, you had to make sure that there's a decent discussion, a pertinent discussion, a to-the-point discussion on some very important content here. So thank you for doing such a fabulous job. Also, thank you for eliciting questions and comments from the audience. It seems you've got quite a few, and for making possible they're getting the necessary answers. So that was really cool. You've already done the summaries, but just to put one challenge to you, which would be to summarize the summaries. So imagine someone really wasn't able to watch the last few minutes. What is the 1 or 2 key messages that you would love, Eric, for people to remember out of this very panel?
I think the thing is that a couple of things, and keeping it short, the point in this being a lens, and it doesn't matter what the name is. And we use stakeholder value, we use long-termism to explain what we believe should be working towards inclusiveness. I think that came up from all of the panelists, that stakeholder perspective, stakeholder value perspective into the long term as really the definition of what more inclusive looks like. I think there's a really big point around not leaving the S and G behind, having so much emphasis on the E. And don't get me wrong, I think we all recognize how many social issues, socioeconomic issues also come from the E. So from us not adequately managing the E, for example, around climate adaptation that will have to happen from climate change, not us being managing the E that well, will have social and governance issues and implications. And I think that's something that really came up. And I think all of the panelists recognize that a lot of work still needs to be done on the S and the G, and especially around measurement, really making it tangible. And measurement, not for the sake of measurement and reporting, but measurement for the sake of being able to steer on it, for able to take really better decisions, and preferably to help us achieve the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and not just for the sake of achieving the Sustainable Development Goals as the world's plan, as was quoted really well as this session, but really because they will enable businesses, they will enable investors to imagine the world of 2030 and beyond, and recognize their place in that world and that image, that future scenario. What is my business model? Will it even have a place when the Sustainable Development Goals have been achieved, and how do we become a winner in that future long-term scenario. And COP26 around the corner, there's no better time to start, and connecting the E with the S and the G a lot clearer and more explicitly. I think that's my attempt in 1 minute.
Well, you did well. So thank you very much for that, for providing that overview and stitching things together. Thanks to Eric and his wonderful panel. We turn to the next agenda item. Cheers.